Wait, they should do what? Do like Hannibal? What, like elephants? No. They tie them to the cattle's heads and light them on fire. That sounds dangerous for all concerned. Huh? War is dangerous for all concerned. Good point. Yeah. Okay, see ya. February 25th, 1944. The enemy keeps attacking and keeps taking your island bases. The army boss doesn't seem to be able to stop them. So what do? Well, if you are Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, you just take over the army. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Soviets eliminated the Korsun pocket, and though tens of thousands of Germans escaped, tens of thousands were either killed or taken prisoner. In Italy, the Allies destroyed the ancient monastery at Monte Cassino, but it turned out not to give them any military advantage. And in the Pacific, a huge raid on the Japanese naval base at Truk did a lot of damage, but not what was expected since the Japanese had moved away all of the major warships. The Americans also made landings on Eniwetok Atoll, a few hundred kilometers northwest of the Marshall Islands. Those landings continue this week. On the 19th, the fighting continues on Engedi, though the Americans now have a regiment ashore. They gain the upper hand the next day. On the 22nd, U.S. forces land on Parry and face fierce Japanese resistance, but on the 23rd, the battle for Parry ends, and with it the whole Eniwetok battle. The Americans lose 300 dead and 750 wounded. They take 66 Japanese POWs. The rest of the 3,400-man garrison is dead. Even though this might seem like an out-of-the-way place to attack, it's not. The combined effect of this successful attack and the seizure of the Marshalls made it possible to bypass the Caroline Islands entirely, and the large Japanese garrison of Truk, like that of Rabaul, was left to contemplate its shrinking store of supplies. The disaster of Truk was the last straw for General Tojo. He had the Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Nagumo sacked and replaced by Navy Minister Shimada, while Tojo himself took over as Chief of Staff of the Japanese Army. It was apparently Tojo's hope that a greater and more personal role in command of operations in the Pacific would enable him to coordinate the Army and Navy more effectively in resisting the American advance. Well, the Americans are not sitting on their laurels, for already the 23rd, Task Group 58.2 raids the Marianas, hitting Rota, Tinian, and Saipan, and sinking 20,000 tons of shipping. Imperial General Headquarters, which had intended that lengthy battles would slow up the Americans as they fought their way through the island barriers, were shocked by the speed with which the assault had come, crashing through the Gilberts and the Marshalls. There was now alarm in Tokyo that the inner line of fortress islands running up from New Guinea through the Palaus and the Marianas would stand up no better. The American carrier strikes on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian in the third week of February robbed the defenders of over 200 aircraft. Japan's combined fleet is still a formidable fighting force, of course. It's not the overwhelming annihilation force that Tojo tells the public it is, and the gigantic expansion in size of the U.S. fleet the past year is pretty much overwhelmingly superior. But remember Yamamoto's dream to lure the American fleet into a final decisive battle? Well, the naval staff was still convinced that they could lure the U.S. fleet to a showdown battle by using their island bases as unsinkable carriers from which to strike at the American task forces when they penetrated the inner defensive perimeter. Some of the Japanese army has been saying, though, that the Imperial Navy won't be able to hold the inner islands, and they should pull back to the Philippines and Formosa and fight this decisive battle on land. Well, they don't say that anymore after Tojo takes over as Chief of Staff. There's a change in Allied command over in Italy this week. On the 22nd, American commander at Anzio, John Lucas, gets a message that 5th Army Commander Mark Clark will arrive the next day. The next day, Clark does arrive and appoints Lucian Truscott to replace Lucas at Anzio. Kind of ironically, the front is now one of careful positional warfare, which would have suited Lucas. Already the 19th, at Truscott's prodding, Lucas orders an attack there. It's fairly successful, taking back a mile or two of land and a couple hundred prisoners, but it does not change the overall situation. And both sides suspend action the 21st, each side having taken some 20,000 casualties since the landings. Last week, a bit to the south, the Allies tried and failed to take the monastery at Monte Cassino, bombing the crap out of it before doing so. And there are those who think that after that, maybe they should rest for the winter. In Casino Town, all 22,000 people have left by now, or died. German paratroopers patrol the town. They are replacing the Panzer Grenadiers around now in this sector. Not far from here, in 217 BC, Hannibal had found himself hemmed in by mountains and Roman troops. Lashing dry twigs to the horns of 2,000 rustled cattle, his soldiers set fire to the faggots and drove the herd onto the heights above confused enemy sentinels, who mistook the flaming beasts for an encircling army of men carrying torches. Fearful of being outflanked, the Romans fled. Hannibal escaped, and his Carthaginians went on to win one of the greatest victories in Western military history at Cannae a year later. No such stratagem occurred to Alexander, Clark, or their lieutenants. The high command seemed in the grip of a plodding fatalism. However, Army Group Commander Harold Alexander is under lots of pressure from London and DC to tie down as many German divisions as he can in advance of the Allies' Normandy invasion. He also wants to prevent German commander in Italy, Smiling Albert Kesselring, from massing any more force against Anzio. The tail now wagged the dog. The Anzio landings had been launched to break the Gustav Line impasse at Cassino. Now, another attack at Cassino was deemed necessary to help the beachhead. More on this next week. For if the fronts in Italy are at a standstill, they are anything but that in the Soviet Union. On the 21st, the Soviets take Cholm and Soltsi. The 23rd, they take Strugi Krasnoye, midway between Luga and Pskov, and on the 24th, take Dno. One by one, the German bastions topple. The scene of fierce fighting in the past, Staraya Russa, Cholm, Shimsk. But the fall of Narva, Pskov, and Ostrov proved for the moment, in spite of Stavka's orders, beyond the Soviet troops. The Soviet offensives had nevertheless achieved its first objective, the elimination of the 18th Army south of Lake Ladoga and on the eastern sector of the Gulf of Finland. Leningrad was free. Most of the Leningrad and Kalinin oblasts had been completely cleared, and Soviet troops were across the Estonian frontier. Behind them lay a trail of smashed towns, burned and blackened villages, and broken bridges. In front of them, the Panther Line, on which they were now closing. Ambitious plans for a rapid thrust into Estonia proved at this juncture too optimistic, yet the Soviet victory was already bringing its political fallout. With the left flank of Army Group North torn to shreds, and the German hold on the northern theater substantially, if not fatally, weakened, the warning lights began to flash for Finland. Pressure on Finland was no doubt part of the, quote, political requirement brought to Govorov's attention by the Stavka Directive on the need to take Narva quickly. Nothing was lost upon the Finns, who had already begun to probe the Soviet attitude in contacts carefully picked out in Stockholm. The Soviets are also taking a big prize in the south of the Eastern Front. On the 21st, they advance around Krivoy Rog. The Axis evacuated the next day. One thing the Soviets are doing here, which is something they did on the Dnieper, is send troops to the next river, in this case it's the Ingulets, to establish a bridgehead before the retreating enemy can set up a strong defense system on the river's banks. Historian Gerhard Weinberg wonders this: it would be worth investigating why the Red Army regularly did this, the American Army usually did it, while the British Army almost never did so. Interesting idea. I will actually quote him about something else now. The collapse of German military power in the Dnieper Bend area and the loss of the Nikopol bridgehead raised once more the problem of the German and Romanian forces cut off in the Crimea in the fall of 1943 and now more isolated than ever. Marshal Antonescu urged Hitler to evacuate Axis troops from the Crimea now that all hope of regaining contact with them was lost. Only the 7 Romanian divisions there could secure the defense of Romania itself from the obviously imminent Soviet invasion. Hitler says no to this, partly because he's worried about the danger to Romanian oil fields from air raids from the Crimea should it fall, but also because it appears he still thinks they can stabilize the Eastern Front, then defeat the Allied invasion in the West, and then reconquer all the territory he's lost in the East the past 7 or 8 months. He also does not want to give Sevastopol back to the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. Antonescu is set to visit Hitler tomorrow, so we will see what happens with that next week. One more thing about Kryvyi Rog. On the 22nd, Stalin tells 3rd Ukrainian Front Commander Rodion Malinovsky that it must be in Soviet hands that same day. He does not want the Axis to destroy the electric power stations there. It is actually cleared by 4 o'clock that same day, and they do save the power installations. The Ingulets River barrier has now been broken. By the end of February, the bend in the lower Dnieper had been swept clean of German troops. The tangle of fortifications flattened, the precious iron ore regions back in Soviet hands, and the German Sixth Army the poorer by 40,000 men. Without the Nikopol bridgehead to menace its rear, 4th Ukrainian Front could launch a full-scale attack on the Crimea, while 3rd Ukrainian Front stood poised to strike at Nikolaevsk, Odessa. In just a few months, the Soviets' Western allies are going to launch full-scale attacks of their own. I talked about Operation Fortitude last week, the Allied plan to deceive the enemy about where and when their cross-channel invasion will hit later this year. There is now a power struggle between Ops B, the Allied Military Deception Planning Department, and David Strangeways, head of Bernard Montgomery's R Force, a deception force who has Montgomery's full backing, as to who is going to do what. On the 23rd, in a meeting between the two sides, Strangeways actually tears up the plan and says he'll write a new one. Everyone thinks he's just gonna write a modified version of the current one, but he is serious. His version calls for 6 Quicksilver plans to be activated. Activating the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, which I talked about 2 weeks ago, putting George Patton instead of Omar Bradley as its commander, and, okay, well, let's just say things start moving, huh? Things are starting to really move on another front, though, in Burma. On the 24th, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt cables British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that General Stilwell is confident his Chinese-American force can seize Myitkyina by the end of this dry season, and once there, can hold it. I realize this imposes a most difficult task, but feel with your energetic encouragement, Mountbatten's commanders are capable of overcoming the many difficulties involved. See, in January, Vinegar Joe Stilwell's force was hacking its way through the jungle when he went to a Southeast Asia command conference. Here, he learned to his dismay that the British wanted to stop his operations entirely. Theater Commander Louis Mountbatten wanted, in fact, to cut off all operations in northern Burma and to focus on amphibious assault against Rangoon and Singapore. Stilwell then sent Hayden Boatner, his deputy, to Washington to tell everyone there what's going on. Boatner manages to convince Roosevelt and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall that Mountbatten's plan basically wants to restore Britain's colonies at China's expense, which is kind of true. Churchill is like, but we are supporting Stilwell with the drive down the Arakan. This is also kind of true. Between Anzio, Casino, Leningrad, Korsun, Kwajalein, and everything else the past few weeks, I haven't had the time to cover it, but the 5th and 7th Indian Divisions, and soon after them the Nigerians of the 81st West African Division, launched such a drive last month. They had, by month's end, advanced down the Mayu Peninsula as far as the jumping-off point for an amphibious assault on the port of Akyab. However, Their rapid advance was part of Japanese strategy, falling back with limited resistance until such a time that the enemy was strung out along the coast, and then they would outflank and destroy them. The Japanese commander of the 15th Army here, by the way, is none other than Renya Mutaguchi, and it was units of his that were involved in the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 that was the spark behind the Second Sino-Japanese War that soon enough became part of this World War. Well, back on the 3rd, his orders had gone out for 55th Division to make a series of hook assaults to cut off British 15th Corps supply. Within a few days, this was accomplished, and 7th Indian was cut off to boot. Thing is, British 14th Army Commander William Slim knew this was going to happen from ultra-intelligence intercepts. So, for the past 2 weeks, British and American planes have been flying in supplies to 7th Indian as 16th Indian Division has headed south to relieve them. See, Slim knows the Japanese are also overextended, but unlike the Allies, cannot be supplied by loads of airdrops. Well, on the 23rd, the relief force breaks through the Nagakya-Dauk Pass, and repeated attacks by the encircled British have caused heavy casualties among Japanese 55th Division, and it is forced to retreat. The first defeat of an Imperial Army frontline division on the Asian mainland by a force of Indian, Nigerian, and Gurkha soldiers was a tremendous boost to British morale. Yes, it is. And far to the north, on the 24th, Merrill's marauders begin marching hundreds of kilometers over the Patkai Mountains and into the Burmese jungle. These are the men of the 5307th Composite Unit, a long-range jungle penetration force. They got the name Merrill's Marauders from war correspondents trying to come up with a name that sounded cooler than the 5307th Composite Unit. It was a Time magazine correspondent that gave them this name, after their leader Frank Merrill, who was appointed by Stilwell. Another Churchill mention this week. On the 22nd, he tells the House of Commons that since the war began, 38,300 British pilots and aircrew have been killed and over 10,000 planes lost. He also talks about the new aerial offensive, the rain of bombs over Germany by day and night. The air power was the weapon which both of the marauding states selected as their main tool of conquest. This was the sphere in which they were to triumph. This was the method by which the nations were to be subjugated to their rule. I shall not moralize further than to say that there is a strange, stern justice in the long swing of events. To go in depth again and again into the bombing campaign and see what it does and does not achieve, check out our War Against Humanity series hosted by Spartacus Olsson. Just to point out a quick stat from Martin Gilbert's The Second World War, which is where that quote from Churchill came from. German monthly production of single-engine fighters the second half of 1943 was 851. For the first half of 1944, despite the bombing, it is 1,581, so nearly twice as many. This week is a week of massive U.S. airstrikes against the German aircraft industry. Sparty covers this. This is Operation Argument, or Big Week. And as for me, this big week of the war has come to its end, with action in Burma, action in the Central Pacific, action in the north and south of the Eastern Front, and action slowing down in Italy. And one more note. On the 20th in Norway, the ferry carrying heavy water on stage 1 of its journey to Germany is sunk by resistance fighters and the cargo lost. The ferry is called Hydro and carries all existing heavy water supplies produced in Norway to send to Germany, and further sends back any development of a German atomic bomb. So, Hideki Tojo is now also Chief of Staff of the Japanese Army. He sure wears a lot of hats at the moment, being Japan's Prime Minister and Minister of War as well. Maybe the consolidation will be good for operations. Maybe. But he's got a lot to deal with. The Allies are on the move through the Pacific Islands, New Guinea, the South Seas, and now Burma. Tojo does have over 2 million soldiers in China at the moment, in addition to all of his occupation forces in places like Malaya, Indochina, and Indonesia that could maybe fight elsewhere. But guess what? His main concern is not the Pacific. It's China and India. Last year, he tried to think of some sort of diplomatic solution to end the war in China, But that failed, so now he's got a new offensive plan to win the war there once and for all and free up loads of men. He's also planning soon, to invade India. Say what? Oh, I bet you did not see that coming, but it is true. Tojo, wearing all his hats, is going on the offensive again, and soon. What in the world will happen? We'll keep watching right here to find out. We have a whole series about the espionage and intelligence war within this war. It's called Spies and Ties, and the playlist will pop up right here anytime now. It is the Time Ghost Army that finances that series and this series, so join the army so we can continue to do this at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest officers. The Time Ghost Army member of the week is Grzegorz Brzezczyszkiewicz. Oh, like the movie. Yeah. Oh, good one. Okay. See you next time.